All right, so this is part 2 of our series. And so last go around, we really focused on laying a foundation around equitable grading and defining certain things. And so today we're going to pick up where we left off during our last session. And so again, I just want to reference the our framework for teaching and learning. And when we think about where some of the ideas that we're talking about today around equitable grading practices, where they're situated within this framework, really looking at that systematic use of data, right? Because grading is one data point that we have. And within equitable grading, we really want to provide multiple opportunities for students to demonstrate their learning. But we also want our grades to reflect mastery of learning so that we can make the best possible instructional decisions for our students. And just as we continue talking through grading, just acknowledging the fact that it can be a very difficult topic to discuss. Sometimes it can be very difficult to reflect on our own practice, but then as we work with other teachers as well, just acknowledging that that is a difficult conversation. So we all come at this with different experiences. So keeping an open mind and open heart, being respectful of one another, even after today's session. If you take certain ideas back to your staff or back to your classroom and colleagues, always being mindful of their experiences as well and being respectful. And then just that commitment to further learning. Grading is one of those things. I mean, you could spend a whole course on just grading and digging into all of those individual practices as you go through there. So just that commitment to further learning. If there are certain pieces that you're like, I'm not so sure about, please look at what others are saying about those same topics. And so I just want to bring this back around, and we referenced this last time as well. So Effie, I know I'm putting you on the spot. Do you want to speak about the policy just briefly, like some of that work that y'all did around writing our equity policy for the district?
Yeah, so we do have an equity policy, which I know still many across the district do not know about, but the policy was unanimously approved January 2020, just about 2 months after I started in this role and came to the district. And it really lays out how we define equity in our district, and also lays out areas where there's more intentional focus to guide our work. And so just when you have a moment to look at board policies, this is a great policy to go and look at because we have lots of work to do. And this policy is just one step on a path to really changing outcomes for the students that we serve.
Thanks, Effie. So I want to give you all just a moment to kind of read over that definition. And we did this last time, I think, for some of you that may have been here, but I do want us to kind of familiarize ourselves with what this, how as a district we've defined equity. So I'm going to be quiet and I'm going to set a 1-minute timer so that you can kind of process. For those of you who have been in PD with me before, you know I'm a big fan of timers. So I want you to just look back over that definition. What key words or phrases stick out to you, and throw those in the chat for me. So what keyword or phrase really speaks to you from this definition, and throw that in the chat so that we can all kind of see those ideas. Yeah, Jane, I think that's huge, right? Ms. Gilmore, you are good. We haven't started any huge discussions yet, so you're good.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I think that idea of commitment is really important as well, right? This does not happen overnight. It is very intentional work and it means you're looking for the long term. Absolutely. Absolutely, beyond equality, right? Equity and equality are not synonyms.
Yeah, and I think actually you make a really good point, because this is really a journey. Equity is just not something that you do, and it's not an overnight, I'm gonna do this and we're not gonna have any more issues. It's truly a journey.
Yep.
Of continuous work.
Absolutely. And so as we continue to have our conversation today, I want us to kind of keep this definition in our mind, because one of the things that really sticks out to me, it talks about all aspects of the learning environment. And yet grading will tackle a lot of things instructionally. We'll talk about strategies all day long and how to deconstruct a standard. But grading is something that often gets overlooked. But if we really want to create equitable environments for our students, it is something that is going to have to be addressed, because it affects so many instructional decisions that we make within the classroom. And so just to kind of reference our last training, one of the questions I left you with was, what traditional grading practices promote inequity and invite bias? And so these are some of the responses. Even if you weren't able to be with us during the first one, this is what some of our participants had to say. So I'm going to be quiet and let you look at that for a moment. And so what I tried to do in designing the second part of this professional development, I've tried to touch on most of these ideas. We only have a limited amount of time together today. So even though I've tried to intentionally build in a lot of these topics, depending on how our conversation goes, we may not get through all the slides today. And that's okay. I would rather have quality conversation than try to rush through anything. So, but these are some of the ideas that were put forth, and I'm going to try to touch on all of them today. We'll see how far we get. If not, I'll give you access to the slide deck after this, and it has resources in there as well. So I want to just remind us all, we want our grading system to be as bias resistant as possible. And when we talk about bias, if you Google the definition, it's a tendency, inclination, or prejudice towards or against someone. You can have positive biases as well as negative biases. And then oftentimes a word that has, or not here lately, a word that we have heard often is the idea of implicit bias. And so those are some of those biases that we're not even aware that we have, that are built off of some of those stereotypes and things like that. So as we talk through our conversation today, we're going to address some of how certain practices invite bias and then promote inequity for our students. So I want to start with an example here. And I want you to take a minute and just look at these two pieces of work. This is second grade. It's a second grade writing sample. And I want you to note what the similarities and the differences may be between these two pieces of work. So I'm going to Once again, I'm going to set a 1-minute timer and be quiet so that you can have some think time. All right. So if anyone wants to unmute, or you can type it in the chat, what's a similarity or a difference that you notice in those two pieces of writing?
So can we just come on the mic and say it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. So they're the exact same, except that the names are changed. The brother's name and the friend's name are different.
Yeah. So you are exactly right. They are identical other than the names. And that name choice was very deliberate, and it was chosen from a list of the most racially distinct names. And that list was created by Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubner, who wrote Freakonomics. And so they put together this list, and so those names were chosen from that list. And so this piece of work, or this example, comes from a study. And if you want to dive into what that article says, it's about, it's not a hard read. The link is there at the bottom of the page once I give you access to this slide deck, and you can kind of read through how this study was set up. But what this individual did was he gave teachers this piece of work. And so he gave, and what he found was, well, let me ask you, what do you think the researcher found when teachers were asked to grade these two pieces of work? And you can throw it in the chat, or you can unmute. What do you think the researcher found when he gave teachers these two pieces of work to grade?
Is it this? I don't want to spoil it for everybody, but is it the same thing that we talked about last time we were together?
It's a little bit different result than we saw last time, which is why I pulled this piece of research. Anybody want to take a guess? What did the researcher find?
If I just had to take a guess, I would say that the one on the right with Deshaun and Aaron was probably graded harder than the one on the left with Connor and Scott.
Yeah, so you're exactly right, Ms. Gilmore. So what this researcher found, and he had teachers grade these twice. So the first time that they graded these pieces of work, he had teachers grade them on these different grade level kind of criteria. There were seven, I think, different distinctions from below grade level to way above grade level. And teachers were just supposed to grade students on those particular ones. So it was far below grade level, slightly below, at grade level, slightly above, and far above grade level. So teachers had to grade it based on those criteria. And when teachers did that, you're exactly right. The student or the piece of work that has a name that indicates a Black student was graded way lower. And so, and you can reference, I put that article there for you to reference, but it was graded lower than the piece of work that had the student's name that indicated it was probably a white student. And so there are no other differences. And for that, so for this particular researcher, for him, that indicated a definite racial bias in his work. The second time that he had teachers grade this piece of work, he saw that bias mitigated, almost disappear completely. Anybody want to guess what he had those teachers do the second time that they were grading?
Did they use a rubric?
Why, Jane, yes, they did. They did use a rubric. And so what this researcher saw is that when they employed the use of a rubric to grade these two pieces of work, and they had some kind of some well-defined criteria by which to grade, it really mitigated and negated that bias that was indicated during that first round of grading. And so as we talk about ways to make our grading more bias resistant, because I don't care who you are in this world, you have biases. Positive, negative, implicit, explicit, we all have them. But rubrics is one of those ways that we can start to mitigate some of those in the classroom. And so I want to share with you 2 examples of rubrics. And so I'm going to go ahead, let me do this. And I'm going to give you access to the slide deck. And we're on slide number 29. I want to give you a couple of minutes to explore those 2 rubrics. Okay, so example 1 and example 2. And if anyone can't get in the document, please let me know, unmute yourself and just say, hey, Ashley, you made a mistake, because we all make them, but just let me know. Okay, will y'all give me a thumbs up if you're able to get in there? Sweet. All right, I'm not throwing anyone under the bus other than myself. Okay, so these are 2 rubrics that I actually used in the classroom. Okay. I hope you can see the progression over time, but I'm not throwing anyone under the bus but myself. So let's just, but these are 2 rubrics that I used with an actual PBL that I did in the classroom. And I want you to take a look at those 2 examples for me. I'm going to set a 2-minute timer. So feel free to click on it, read it, jot down any notes that you need to. So I'm going to set my timer here on the screen and give you some think time. So I just want you to take a look at those 2 examples for right now and just note any differences that you see, any observations. And that's all we're doing right now. All right. So I want to start and just hear your thoughts. What are some things that you noticed about either example 1, example 2, a comparison of the two? And you will not hurt my feelings, even though these were mine that I used. You're not going to hurt my feelings. Go ahead. What did you notice? You can throw it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself, because there's not that many of us.
So honestly, for the first example, I don't know that I personally would have considered it to be a rubric because there aren't clearly defined differences between the scores, like what constitutes a 10 out of 10.
Okay, yeah, I would totally agree with that. That was my first year teaching middle school, just FYI. For all y'all friends. So don't judge me too harshly. All right, what else do you notice? So maybe rubric 1 or example 1 is not even a rubric. All right, so what else do you notice?
I would say I like rubric 2, of course, because it's a lot more explicit in what the expectations are for how to achieve each score.
Yep, absolutely right. It's more clearly defined, right? Part of the purpose of a rubric is to have clear expectations for students. So I would agree with that. All right, what else? Any other observations?
Yes, I was raising my hand in case you're going to call me. I like that the second one had quantifiable, like you could count 1, 2, 3, or 1 or 2. And it had specific milestones as the student progressed that they could check themselves against.
Okay, awesome. Any others? So if you're thinking through the lens of bias, which one do you think would do a better job of helping to negate some of the biases that we may have? You can hold up a number, you can say it out loud, or you can put it in the chat. Which one? I see Tina's, she's holding up her number 2. Anybody else? Yeah, and so when we look at that, yes, the use of rubrics can help to negate some of those, some of the harmful effects that a bias might have when we're going to grade a student, but not all rubrics are created equal, obviously. I did learn quite a bit, so I like to learn. You can, a lot of growth there over time. But when we think about,
Ashley, quick question. Did you create that using a rubric generator, or you just came up with it on your own?
Yeah, I just created it in Google Docs. It's one that I use with my students. Yep. I would actually, well, we'll talk about it in just a second. I would actually have it printed for students so that they had it in front of them. I taught middle school, so half of them lost it. But I would have them, I would actually print it for them. And then a lot of times I'd have them put it in their interactive notebook too, so they could keep it. Gotcha. But yeah, it's just one that I created with Google Docs. Actually, we created it as a PLT after going through some training. But one of the things when we talk about rubrics is they're not all created equal, right? Obviously, my first attempts at rubrics were not very successful. But really, when we look at creating some of those, thinking about how we delineate between the content or skills that students are supposed to be demonstrating that are aligned to standards versus soft skills. Oftentimes, you see teachers want to include soft skills in their rubric, which is great. Students need feedback. But when we talk about a grade and what a grade should represent, we want to make sure that we maintain the grade integrity and that our grade is communicating mastery of standards. And so that's why you'll see in the second one, we kind of delineated, and they had 2 different scores, one that got entered in a grade book and one that was just feedback for them overall on some of those soft skills that we were working on as a class. At that point, collaboration was big in our class. We were about halfway through the school year at that point, as well as teaching them how to actually deliver an engaging presentation, that it is not reading from a note card or having a whole paragraph that you read from a PowerPoint. That was a really tough lesson for 7th graders. And so in our rubrics, being mindful of what the content and skills we are really grading that are aligned to those standards. And then not that soft skills are not important, because they are, but communicating those separately. And then also another key is to share that with students. Ms. Gilmore kind of hit on this, or maybe it was Tina, that first rubric, students don't understand how they get their 10 out of 10. There was no clear communication of expectations. And one thing that I used to do for kids, and I didn't do this the first year, but as I had been teaching and I had examples to pull from, showing them what mastery really looked like and having them practice using a rubric. Oftentimes we want to think because kids sit through so much school that they just know how to use those or know what they're used for innately, and that's not true. They need practice. Just like I needed practice creating them, they need practice reading and understanding them. And then one of the other big things as we think about utilizing a rubric to help us mitigate some of that bias is write it in student-friendly language. Like, don't just copy and paste from the standards, because oftentimes that's written in teacher language, and this is for students. Yes, I'm using it to grade, but it's also for them to know what the expectation is. And if there's language in there that they can't understand, we need to make sure it's written in student-friendly language. So just some kind of things to keep in mind as we think about the use of rubrics to help address some of those biases. I want us to take a second and do a little self-reflection as we think about the next part of this. And I want you to think about your experiences in the classroom. And think about a time, or think if this has ever happened to you. Has there ever been a time in your educational career where a colleague has come to you and said something about a student, positive or negative, that led you to have a positive or negative bias about that student? And I want you to take a minute just to think through that. And then when you've had a moment to think, this is totally anonymous, I want you to tell us about that experience. Or maybe it was you that did it to a colleague, but it's totally anonymous. No one's going to know who said what. It's a Mentimeter, so you can click on the link in the chat, or you can go to menti.com and put in the code that's at the top of the screen. But I just want you to think about that scenario. Has a colleague ever told you things about a student that led to a bias about that particular student? I just want you to tell me about it. And if you've not had that experience, awesome, say that as well. But I want to give you a minute.
Ashley, I'm not able to type in mine. Clicking that link, it says no active question for this presentation.
Let me present and see if it changes it. It's update. Why is it? Okay.
Should be.
Try to refresh your page and see if that helps. Anybody else having trouble?
Okay, I got it now.
Sweet.
Thank you.
Nope, no problem. Thank you, Ms. Hill. Oh yeah. The student placement cards can tell you a lot. Yep. So if you look at what some of your colleagues are saying, and if you're still working on putting yours in the Mentimeter, you still have time. But it looks like we all have some very similar experiences. We've all been in that teacher workroom, or we've all gotten our brand new roster at the beginning of the year, and our colleague has looked over our shoulder and said, good luck with that one. or even us, we've had cousins, sisters, brothers, and because of some of those experiences, we've already developed biases about some of our students. And so I want you to think, how might some of these experiences that you see on the screen, how might that affect the way that we grade students? And we talked a little bit about this last time too. But how might that affect the way that I grade?
Well, I think that it would impact our expectations for those students, whether it's something positive or something negative. And so then we react through our grading, even if it's a new student we've never had before, right? Like I was the one who put on my comment about how that stayed in my mind, even though I went in with the fresh, fair mindset about this new student, but it's still in the back of my mind. So, our actions and such can be jaded, as someone said in the chat box, by those comments.
Yeah. So Ms. Gilmore, I think you brought this up last time too. One of the strategies that you use to kind of help yourself step out of that, right? Well, I think it was you that talked about one of the strategies. Do you want to share that again?
Sure. Well, just I don't look at the names. I don't look at student names when I'm grading their work. I just go through, well, now with Speed Grader, I just pull it up and I just grade it. I don't even look at whose name's on it. That's helped a lot.
Yeah, and so that is one of the strategies when you look at what strategies for helping to mitigate bias as much as possible. Blind grading is one of those. And so there are different ways that you can do that and accomplish that. A lot of the technology that we have now will allow you to hide student names. So you mentioned Speed Grader. There's an option that will allow you to hide names as you go through Speed Grader. Some of the other tools, this is Class Kick, which is one that our teachers use a lot too. But it'll allow us to do some of that. But even as simple as having a student, if you're doing an exit ticket or something paper pencil that's going to be graded, have them put their name on the back of the paper, or somewhere where it's not in your face, to where you look at that and you say, oh, they're AG, they should have done da 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 da, or this person never pays attention. And you're letting some of those things creep into the way that we grade. And so that's one of the strategies in looking at how might we start to address some of these pieces. So one of the things that was brought up in the feedback, or in the question that was posed at the end of the session, some of those traditional grading practices that are perhaps inequitable and invite bias. One of the ones that was entered into the Mentimeter was the idea of extra credit. And so I want us to take a minute and consider this scenario. And so I'm going to give you a moment to read it. And I'm getting ready, I think we have enough people now. I'm getting ready to break us out into some breakout rooms so we can have some smaller group discussion. But I want us to consider, does this opportunity allow all students to take equal advantage of improving their grade? So that's the question I want you to kind of talk through about this particular scenario. And so I'm going to break you into a couple groups. I'm going to give you about I'm going to give you about 3 or 4 minutes to discuss, and then I'll pull you back in so we can discuss whole group, some different ideas about extra credit. Anybody have questions before I break you out? All right. Hey, Stephanie.
Hey.
Hey. We just jumped into breakout rooms to discuss in the scenario that's on the screen about extra credit. Do you want to take a minute to I can put the link to the slide presentation in the chat and you can kind of peruse it, or do you want to jump right into a breakout room? What's your preference?
Look and see what we're doing first.
Sweet. I'm all about giving options. So let me put this link in the chat for you, okay?
Okay. And I think my principal wants to get in touch with you about doing something like this one day at our school. Just FYI.
Awesome. All right. So there's the link to the presentation. And today is part 2, but all of the slides from part 1 are there too. So you can kind of peruse through there until we pull people back from their groups.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You are very welcome. Sometimes I hate being thrown into a group right away.
Ashley, I have a question for you. I'm actually at a school, but I'm trying to leave. I'm trying to do it on my phone, trying to get Zoom on the phone. Every time I try to do it, it's asking me for a passcode. Could you email me the link again, and maybe I could try to do it that way?
Let me, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a minute so I can
Okay,
do
I'm
that.
sorry.
No, you're fine. It's just an unshare, you're good. Let me go here. Yeah, because I didn't put a passcode on there. So let me see. Let's see.
Because if you email me the link, maybe I could try one more time opening it through my email.
Yep. So let's try this. See if that works.
Okay. It says connecting.
Did it work?
It's waiting for me to for you to let me in, see if you see me again.
All right. Let me see. Yes, I do see you. I will let you in. There you go, Betsy.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
You are welcome.
Let me get out of here. Okay, I'm in now, so that's good.
All right, awesome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
If you want to send me back into a breakout room, because now I'm under something different, that'll be cool.
Getting ready to pull them all back in.
Oh, okay, that's fine. I'm sorry. I took.
You were good. You were good. See, here we come.
All right.
All right. So when you think about this scenario, I hope you had some time to talk to some different people. Does that opportunity allow all students to take equal advantage of improving their grade? So anyone want to unmute and talk a little bit about what your group talked through when we think about this particular scenario? Anybody?
I'll start.
Okay.
We talked about several different things. The first is that not all students have the availability of transportation to get there. And depending on where it's located, it might be, a far commute for the students. We also talked about that they may not have the technology to take the selfie. And what was something else? We just generally discussed that it's not necessarily fair to give them a grade for behavior. And then we also, someone also said that it also hurts people who have like 2 working parents, or their parents work at night or something like that, wouldn't be able to take them. Did
Absolutely.
I get it all?
And even from a high school perspective, many of our high school students work after school. So not just from a parent perspective, but a lot of, if you thought about this from a high school lens, a lot of those individuals, I did, and I played sports and I had a job that I went to after school. So holistically, when we talk about extra credit, I think it is one of those things that comes from a very good place in teachers' hearts, right? We want to see students do well. But when it comes down to implementation, it can be very, very inequitable. So what are some other ways that you've seen teachers offer extra credit in the classroom, or you yourself? I'll throw myself under the bus. Probably that same year I created Rubric 1, I gave students extra credit for bringing in their lab safety contracts signed by parents, because that's something I had to have before we could do labs. Did that have anything to do with standards or any bearing on education? Like their learning? Not so much, but they got a bonus 100 for bringing it in. What are some other ways you've seen teachers give extra credit in the
I am
classroom?
also guilty of having done that. Beginning of the school year, I give out a student data form with all the information for a parent or guardian. So you bring it back, after a week or two, you get, 100 homework grade or something like that. So I'm definitely guilty of that one. But another extra credit opportunity I give occasionally, not so much this year, but I give them an opportunity to take like a quizzes or something like that. And it's open to all of them. And they all actually do have access to it. So I give them that opportunity, and it's there. Honestly, I would love to know. I'd love some feedback to know if anything about that is inequitable in some way, so that way I can know if I need to not.
I'd have to, okay, we can talk about that one. Let's see if anybody else has other examples first of extra credit. Anybody?
I was sharing in our group. I'll chime in. I was sharing in our group when I first started teaching. It was kind of common practice. That's been a long, long, long time ago. So when you start to know better, you start doing better. But our school would oftentimes have like school night, but it would be at the skating rink or bowling alley, or somewhere where it was really like a fundraiser. I think it was, I don't know, somewhere else where you could get pizza and play games and all kinds of stuff, something almost like a Chuck E. Cheese, but that wasn't exactly what it was.
Yeah.
And how families who could not afford to go, how that excluded them, but you're giving an unfair advantage to kids whose families can't afford to take them to those events. And it had nothing to do with their ability to show mastery of standards that we're teaching in the classroom. So that was one way, that was one thing that I did way back in the day. That created a level of unfairness for children that I was serving.
Yeah, one of the district office coaches, we're partnering to do some of this work too. She was talking about when she was in the classroom, she would give kids 10 extra credit points on like a test if they saw her out and spoke to her, like went up, introduced themselves and spoke to her. She's like, now looking back, like, how is that fair? Because like, it's a game of chance. Either they saw me or they didn't. And like 10 points could be the difference between an A, a B, a C. I mean, that's a whole letter grade difference for some of those students. So it's interesting as we start reflecting back, just like Effie said, like we all have done things. And it's where my dad was a preacher. So like the verse where it says little is known, little is required, much is known, much is required. So as we learn best practice, really evaluating what we're doing in the classroom. And so I want to share a couple other, Miss Gilmore, I have not forgotten, we're coming back and we're going to talk about your example, okay? But here's some other ways that I've seen teachers give extra credit. I taught middle school and we used to do a canned food drive. And this one teacher won, 8th grade, she taught math, won every year. Well, she would give kids extra bonus points for every like 10 or 15 cans they brought in. So these kids were bringing in like 50 and 60 cans so that they could get extra credit points on their tests. No wonder she won every time. But also cleaning supplies. I've seen teachers give out extra points on assessments for cleaning supplies. The one I'm guilty of, parent signatures. But also a big one in our district right now, I've heard multiple people talk about teachers giving out extra 100s if the parents will complete the panorama survey. That was a big one here recently. Extra credit for attending events. I always put restaurant menus on here because when I took Spanish, we could get extra credit if we went to the Spanish restaurant. Not that we used the language because there was no way to really monitor that. But if we brought back the menu or our receipt, we could get extra credit points. So that's one from my own experience in school. But all of those things I've seen teachers use to give students extra credit. Even the idea of like pop culture questions at the bottom of tests. I've seen multiple teachers do things like that. I was telling Effie just the other day, I love history. My world history teacher would give us bonus 100s if we could answer his trivia questions. And so, like I said, my dad was a pastor. So when we were talking about the Israelites and that time period in history, I racked up a lot of extra 100s because, I mean, I knew it all. And so thinking about some of those things and how inequitable it can be for our students. And when we look at what research says, there are two groups especially that when we think about extra credit that are less likely to take advantage. And that's our academically struggling students and our students who come from lower income families. And it's because of resources, right? They might not have equitable access to some of those resources. And quite often what we see with some of those extra credit opportunities, it's not tied to standards a lot of times. And so there's a lot, not only is it inequitable, but it can compromise that grade integrity as well. And so then my question becomes, extra credit is one of those pieces that I do feel like comes from a good place in teachers' hearts. We do not want to see students fail. So if we're not giving extra credit because it's likely inequitable for our students, then what do we do? What's the answer? And so I'll be quiet if anyone wants to answer that. If anyone has opinions.
So I used to give credit back to students if they missed questions on a math test. And I had a little form for them to fill out. And when I graded their test, I would, like if they missed 5 questions, I would include, there were 3 to a page, so I would include 5 forms. And it said, it was Sim, sometimes I make a mistake. And they would tell what they did wrong, what the correct answer was, and then what they're going to do to not make that mistake again. So I always forget to regroup the tens column or whatever it was, that they had to tell me something that would keep them from making that error in the future. And if they didn't do all those things, then they would get no points back. So they had to do all 3 parts. So if they just went and wrote all the right answers, then they would get 0 points back. But ended up being like, once I kind of used to it, they loved it because they knew that they were more willing to make mistakes during a test, because if they did make a mistake, they knew they would have a chance to correct it later.
Yeah, it's not hopeless, right? Yeah. Anybody else? So that's kind of the idea of like redoing part of an assessment or an assignment. Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts? If not extra credit to bring a student grade up, then what?
I was just thinking very similar to kind of like what Jane said, but I like how she elaborated on it to make the students more reflective about the process. Yep. And not just going back through the process, but then taking a moment to think like, where did I go wrong in the first place? I was just going to be very simple and say retakes, redos, but I like that elevation that Jane put on it.
Yeah. And so Dr. Lupton is exactly right. That idea of retaking or redoing, right? Instead of creating multiple assignments, which can create more work for the teacher in that sense, that I'm creating something else, I'm having to collect another set of evidences, looking at some of the assignments and assessments that we already have, and how can we utilize those to allow retakes and redos, to Jane's point, so that a mistake isn't crippling, right? That it's recoverable. And it really promotes that idea of a growth mindset in students, that even if we do make a mistake, if I reflect on it, learn from it, and can now give you the correct answer, I've learned that material, being able to recover from it. And so retaking and redoing assessments, and I think that's one of the places where technology can help with some of that, how we can quickly reuse some of those maybe test items that we've used to create a new quiz, or whatever the case may be, or maybe it's a flip grid response to some of the questions. Maybe they're explaining their answer instead of retaking the multiple choice test, or whatever it is. But allowing students to retake and redo, as opposed to offering extra credit, which all students may not be able to take advantage of. And to Jane's point, I saw the same thing with my students. Like, once they got used to the process of retaking, and I used to tell them, no, you can't retake an assessment, you just took it. Like, how did you relearn it? Like, you had to, but that they had to relearn to retake. It became one of those things that I saw a lot of hopefulness in students that had learned the game of school and learned that failure was part of the game. I saw a lot more hopefulness in those students because they had the chance to recover and to retake and redo. So I think that is one of those solutions when we look at, if not extra credit, then what? So I want to pose another question to you. Effort and participation are huge when we talk about bias in grading, because effort and participation are behaviors when your grade should really reflect mastery of content, your progress thus far. And so I want you to think, and I'm going to give you some time to think. Sometimes people say they're going to do that and they just ask for your answer. I want you to think, how do teachers grade participation? How do they, and at the elementary level, I know we have some elementary folks in here, that's a mandatory part of some of their grade. I want you to think, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and you can go ahead and start typing your answers in the chat, but don't hit enter just yet. So how do teachers grade participation? I got my timer going. What are the ways that you as a teacher, you've seen your colleagues, maybe as teachers you work with, how do they grade participation? And you can type your answer in the chat, but don't hit enter just yet. Got less than a minute left. All right, so go ahead and hit enter if you've already got yours in there. All right. So in virtual learning, I think you're right. Participation has been, do you have cameras on? Have you shown up? A lot of behavioral aspects there, absolutely. And so then how is some of that different from grading effort? What are the ways that we include effort in a grade? Anybody? How is the way that we include participation and effort different from some of the? Okay, length and quality of answers. What else? How many of you have seen a student, especially maybe one that struggles, and you or your teachers have said, oh, but he's always in class on time, or he always raises his hand, or well, if I don't give him a few extra points, he's not going to pass. How many of you have heard things like that before? Yeah. And once again, I think that comes from a really good place in a teacher's heart, right? A lot of times when we talk about effort, we talk about these grade hacks and how can we help a student boost their grade just a little bit so that they're not failing or so that they get that A. Mine was an A. I remember distinctly my 6th grade teacher pulling me aside and telling me that she had given me points the previous quarter because she wanted to see me be one of the ones that got all A's, like the all A award at the end of the year. So, I mean, it's not just for our struggling students, it's for others as well. But a lot of times when we think about how we include participation, a lot of times teachers have an actual category in their grade book that they utilize. Whereas effort tends to wiggle its way into our grading a little bit more covertly. And we'll add points, bump things to give students a little boost in their grade. And so my question becomes, when we include participation and effort into our grade, how does that open the door for bias? Because the research is really clear.
I've seen it where you get a kid that doesn't write well, that gets the answer correct, and then you've got another little girl or little fella that does neat work, and the answer is correct, but it doesn't look like the kid put forth any effort, so you're automatically going to be biased for the messy work because he didn't do his best.
Oh yeah. And that was me and my brother. My brother, I was AG and my brother was EC. And so if you can imagine his struggle coming up behind me in school, it was tremendous. And my brother, even to this day, cannot write. I don't know what he would do if like he really, when he went to basic training, we had to like interpret his letters for people because they had no idea what he was saying. And so you're exactly right. Even if my brother was right, a lot of times he would get counted wrong or points deducted because he was so messy in his handwriting. Yep. So that's one way maybe. And there, when we talk about the use of participation and effort, it's not just like there is no single type of bias that creeps in. There are lots. Gender, class, race, all of those tend to creep in. So what are some other ways that including those pieces might invite bias into our grading? Anybody?
I'm going to speak from the high school perspective of something I've seen before. And that is when we talk about participation and effort, kids in, let's say, an honors level class who honestly didn't put in a lot of effort or, really didn't participate like they should have, might have that grade bumped or might be, have a favor done, kind of like you mentioned before. Whereas like the essentials level class, kids are like, oh, my expectations are much higher. You need to meet this level of expectation. And so then they aren't given that bump, right? And so their grade does not reflect that favor. Or, yes, I've seen that. And that's very harmful.
Yep, you're exactly right. And when we look at what research tells us about participation and effort, and Evie and I had this conversation just the other day, there are all different types of biases when we look. You can pull research on gender, class, you can pull it on race. And so especially going back to let me go back here. If you go back to our example that I showed at the beginning of our second grade sample here, one of the things that rose, that was revealed during a lot of this is that when they looked at who scored these or who scored the Black students lowest, it was of course white teachers, but then white females. And so when we look at some of those racial biases, our students of color, for lots of reasons, end up suffering when we include participation and effort, whether it's because we view their behavior one way or the other, and we let that influence the way that we grade in the classroom. And so I want to share this quote with you. It's one of my favorites and it's really powerful. And I won't read the whole thing to you, but Stiggins and Conkle did a study where they went in and observed teachers' grading practices. And then they asked for students to reflect on what affected their grade. So what behaviors, what in the classroom, outside the classroom, what things affected their grades. And you can see some of the things that they thought was important. Behaviors like being attentive, completing your assignments, trying hard. All of those were things that they had said. But then if you get down, it says, these data and the high school student profile data on teachers' assessment practices led Stiggins and Conkle to conclude that there is a stereotypical personality type that teachers respond to favorably. Students who appear attentive and aggressive during class and who therefore receive higher grades than others, not because they have learned more material, but because they have learned to act like they are learning more. And so that to me spoke volumes. And I know we can all sit here and name a student who has gotten good grades, but has flown under the radar and really didn't understand the curriculum, didn't really understand, but because they were compliant, they participated, they collaborated the way that they were supposed to, that a lot of times that effort and but effort and participation ended up boosting their grade. When in actuality, when it came down and to look at what they really had mastered, there were big gaps. And I think we can all name students like that. I can think of one of mine right now. And I mean, I look back at my teaching career and I can see that. But when we think about behavior and including that in that student grade, it opens that door wide open for bias. And there are lots of studies out there. If you're interested in any of them, I can send them your way to look at what the studies say about bias and participation and effort. Anybody else have thoughts around participation and effort before we move on? The ways that it can invite bias into our grading system. Yeah, and Jane, you're exactly right. Like, participation looks different for everyone. Even thinking from the lens of introverted students and extroverted students, right? Like, if the way that we include participation is how many times a kid talks in class, our introverted students are going to suffer because they may be less likely to speak out if it's whole class. Anybody else? All right. So the last thing I want to tackle, and it goes back to one of the suggestions that was given by teachers, is the idea of homework. And teachers always, just like grading, I feel like teachers have very strong opinions of homework, either in favor of, not in favor of, how it should be done, how it shouldn't be done. But when we think about homework, what's the purpose of homework? Or what should be the purpose of homework? And you can put it in the chat or you can unmute. There's just a few of us, we can talk.
Actually, I think it's homework is practice of what they've learned already.
All right, so you are exactly right, Betsy, and multiple people have put that in the chat as well, that it should be for practice, right? Some type of practice. I've seen some teachers use it like a flipped classroom model and use it for front loading. But most often it's used for practice. And so when we think about homework and including homework as part of a student's grade, why might that be problematic? Stephanie, I have very strong feelings about homework. Yep. But why might it be problematic?
Because if you haven't mastered it and you're still figuring it out, you're going to get punished for not understanding something you're just learning.
Yep, absolutely. Jane?
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Nope. Go ahead.
Me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. Having high school kids, like,
Oh, you froze, Miss Gilmore. So Jane brought up
like
the
you said
idea.
earlier, who have jobs or who have to go home and watch.
Absolutely, right? Like, not all high school students, like, from my perspective, I grew up in poverty. And so if I wanted money to play my sports, to buy all the equipment and to do that and to have gas in my car and all of that, like, I had to have a job. And so I worked quite a few days after school. So yeah. And a lot of our students go home and take care of siblings. I was lucky enough, my brother and I are only 2 years apart. So, I mean, I didn't have any younger siblings I had to watch, but that's a reality for a lot of our kids. They're surrogate parents for some of these students, for some of their younger siblings. That was true when I taught middle school. A lot of my middle school kids would go home and take care of younger siblings. Any other reasons it might be inequitable?
So this is more, I guess, in creating it to be problematic, but also creates inequitable situations down the road, is when teachers assign a great number. So I'm thinking mathematics, because that was my forte when I was teaching. So when teachers would assign a great number of very similar questions, but if students go home and they don't really know how to, like, they didn't really achieve mastery or understanding in the class, but now they're going to go home and practice it 50 times over. But that practice starts to become learned memory. And I mean, they don't know whether they're doing it right or wrong. They're attempting in the process and doing it and getting to some form of an answer. And I feel that that becomes problematic because that becomes a misconception that then has to be unlearned to then to be taught the actual process or, you know, skill to get to the correct answers.
Yeah. And so that's, Stephanie said that, echoed that same thought in the chat. You're exactly right. And so when we talk about homework, typically there are two approaches to grading homework. Teachers either grade for accuracy. Did you get it? Did you get them right? Did you get them wrong? Or they grade for completion. And there are pros and cons to both of those when you think from an equity lens. And so when you think about accuracy, and we have all said that the purpose of homework, one of the major reasons is for practice, then really delineating what are those activities for learning or assessments of learning. And if students are still practicing, should they be penalized for making those mistakes? It kind of undermines that idea of a growth mindset, right? Then they become less likely to take risk and make mistakes. They won't do it, or they'll copy someone that they think gets it right. It also, we don't really know who's doing the work. Like, what are you really grading when you grade for accuracy? Is it something that those students know? Or is it something their older sibling knows? Or is it something, now we have technology that for a lot of things, all I have to do is use Google Lens and scan the question and the answer will pop right up for me. So what are you really grading when you grade homework for accuracy? And when you start grading for completion, that has its own set of problems. Grade integrity being one of them. Is the grade that I'm giving students really a communication of mastery? But also, are you really grading that student? Or are you grading their home environment, which Ms. Gilmore spoke to? This idea that a lot of our students, they may work, they may care for other siblings, but even outside of that, we know research tells us that certain things can contribute to whether or not students complete their homework. And so some of those are educational level of parents. Do they speak the native language, which for us is English, right? I say native. Do they speak the dominant language, which for us is English? Do they have internet access? A lot of the things that we ask students to do demand some type of access to digital resources. And then the overall home environment. It becomes really hard to read 4 chapters in a book if there isn't a quiet space to do that. I think of one of my kids who, when I taught, I just want to cry because everyone was so hard on this kid, and he was a survivor. And I used to ask him, I say, Luis, why don't you have your homework today? And I did not grade homework. I'd say, Luis, why don't you have homework today? And he never wanted to talk about it until one day he stayed after class, and just by happenstance that he stayed and we started talking, it was not only him that lived there, but his extended family. So his aunt and their kids lived there with him, as well as his grandparents. So you're talking about a lot of people in a little bit of space. And he's like, it's just never quiet. And you talk about something hitting you like a ton of bricks. And I didn't take it for a grade or anything like that. But even still, like, to think that some of these teachers had this preconceived notion of Luis, that he was lazy or he was this, when, man, Luis is like, he has a lot to do at home in the afternoons. And my heart broke for Luis. Because to hear what some teachers had to say about him, it just broke my heart. But we know when some of these pieces are in place, students are more likely to do their homework. So really, if we're giving completion grades, it becomes a little bit, it becomes an equity issue, because not all of our students have the same home environment that's conducive to doing homework. And I think too, a lot of students don't do homework just because they don't understand that connection. It wasn't until I was a smart kid, but to really understand the connection between homework and academic success did not happen until my junior year when I took AP Calc. And I had a teacher that made homework optional. So you know what I did? I opted right on out of it. I said, okay, we're not doing this. Miss Carol Lowe, she is one of the reasons I became an educator. She is fantastic. But she did a lot of work in talking to us about doing your homework. And she was very strategic. She didn't overload homework, but it was always optional if we needed practice. That first quarter, I did not do my homework, and I had never made below an A in my life. I made a C in Miss Lowe's class. And you talk about being devastated. I thought I was never going to college. But she worked with me, and that my failure didn't have to be the end there, or in my eyes, what I deemed as failure. She let me recover from a lot of those mistakes. And so she was an amazing teacher. But building that bridge too in that culture, because a lot of times teachers will say, well, if I don't grade it, they won't do it. Well, let's look at what we're really doing in the culture that we're building as well. And so that's a whole lot in a little amount of time, and we've got about 5 minutes left. I use this quote in the beginning, and I come back to it at the end, that no classroom can be truly equitable until we address this inequitable foundation of our schools. And Joe Feldman's talking about grading in that quote. And so, like I said, grading often gets overlooked in this conversation of equity. But when we look at how many academic decisions are made based on grades, it needs to be part of the conversation. And so today, and the work that Effie and I have been doing, is to really try to make teachers and leaders think about the way that we grade and how can we start to transition our grading practices. And so I'm going to get you to fill out the attendance here in just a moment. But before I have you do that, I want you to think about your own classroom or the teachers that you work with, because I know some of you work in a different capacity, or think about the teachers that you work with in your school. And I want you to think about, where do you see these practices showing up for you or your teachers that you work with? And what are some logical next steps? And so if you didn't exit out of the Mentimeter before, it should still be up for you. But if you did, you can go to menti.com. But I want to give you a second to reflect, because we're all kind of at different points in this whole journey. But I want to give you a moment to reflect before we kind of go our own separate ways. What are some logical next steps as we talk about grading and equity, and how we can try to make our grading practices so that they are more equitable and reduce that bias? And I can actually throw the link in the chat again as well. I'll try to do that. So where do you see these practices showing up for you or the teachers you work with, and what are logical next steps? Awesome. Examples are definitely important as you have this conversation and having lots of open discussion. You're exactly right. So as you think about logical next steps and you think about how you continue this conversation either with teachers or how you continue to improve your own practice within the classroom, I would love to be a resource that helps. If you have questions or things like that, please feel free to reach out. In the link for the presentation today, several slides up, it was part of part 1. I put a link to a resource there that has lots of grading articles about different parts of grading, homework, even things like the 100-point scale and the 0. I mean, there's so much there. But that resource is available in the slide deck from today if you want to look at any of it. Another resource that like I live and breathe, I love it. And a lot of the teachers that I work with, when they ask, it's the book Grading for Equity. And so it breaks down a lot of the ideas that we've talked about. It gives a lot of research, and then he gives a lot of examples. It's a great book too if you're looking at diving in and taking a deeper dive into equity and grading specifically. And so before you go, I want to make sure that we get your attendance for today. And so let me put this link in the chat. And then I did put it in the PD system. It hasn't been approved yet. So as soon as it's approved, I'll go back and look at the attendance sheet and shoot you a message so that you'll know to go into the PD system so that you can get credit for attending today. Today's session has been recorded, so I'll work on getting that uploaded. I try to normally put them in YouTube because that tends to be the easiest way to share them. So as soon as that is done as well,